An important statement from the IRS this week on churches and politics. The agency says pastors who endorse political candidates from the pulpit will no longer have to worry about losing their tax-exempt status.
Lori Johnson brings us this look at the IRS decision and its implications for churches in America.
The Johnson Amendment, a 70-year-old tax provision, forbids all 501c3 nonprofit organizations from endorsing or opposing political candidates. Now, however, the IRS issued an exemption to churches and other houses of worship. The agency made the statement in a Texas court filing as part of a settlement with two churches and the national religious broadcasters who were suing the IRS for violating their freedom of speech.
I believe that anybody that holds to a biblical and theological position would be in favor to allow pastors to endorse political candidates.
The filing states it's acceptable for a house of worship to speak to its congregation concerning electoral politics viewed through the lens of religious faith, as long as it's done through its customary channels.
I think that the key is it's internally facing. Now, it may be accessible to the general public, but you would have to go to the church's website. You would have to go to the church and actually be there for a sermon delivery. I mean, as in the post-COVID world, I think a lot of churches broadcast where it's accessible by the public, but it is still really designed at the end of the day. It's about an internal communication happening amongst the church.
And as long as the church does not intervene in a political campaign, comparing acceptable communication to a family discussion concerning candidates.
This new filing in the court implements this widespread understanding by churches that when we're talking about these issues as a family, it's basically the same thing as gathering around the kitchen table with your family and having these sorts of sane conversations.
Even the Bible records religious figures discussing politics.
One great example of that, for instance, would be either Elijah, that spoke out against his king at that time, or John the Baptist, who spoke out against Herod Antipas.
Today, there are a number of potential red flags.
I think pastors need to be very cautious before they endorse a particular individual, because that person could go ahead and surprise them in their tenure as a political leader. Secondly, it does have the potential, right, to divide a church. I also think that it potentially could have churches be vulnerable, perhaps to monetary donations that might be given in order to secure a particular endorsement.
President Trump has called for the repeal of the entire Johnson Amendment. For now, however, the IRS says that only churches are exempt. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Well, this is a victory for free speech. It's also a victory for freedom of religion. But keep in mind, this is very narrow. And as a result of it being very narrow, we need to keep in mind, let's repeal the Johnson Amendment. The history of it is obviously political. Here, Lyndon Johnson's running for Senate in the state of Texas, and his opponent creates a foundation that's tax exempt. And so he puts money into that foundation, gets a tax deduction, then uses the foundation to campaign against Lyndon Johnson. Johnson won the election and said, well, you're never going to be able to do that to me again. I'm going to make sure that tax-exempt money doesn't go into political campaigns. And let me underline tax-exempt money that you can get a deduction for. So that's the history of the Johnson Amendment. In its application, it's been all over the board. And for the most part, the IRS has not enforced endorsements from pulpits. And you can get into slicing and dicing that as it, support of candidates they agree with. I mean, it really can get to that granular level that, if a church has a political candidate come to the Sunday service, is that an endorsement or not? All of those things were part of trying to figure out what in the world do you do as a church, and how do you either follow this or say, I want to insist on my freedom of religion and my freedom of speech. For me, the ultimate expression of this was when Barack Obama ran for president, And the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, said we endorse Barack Obama for president of the United States. In my view, that's part of their existence. That's what they're there for. That's why they have a tax exemption, in order to promote minority interest in the United States. That's part of the reason they exist. But because it was an endorsement of a political candidate, they got investigated by the IRS. The IRS didn't revoke their tax-exempt status, but the main fact that they can investigate, you know, in the American Revolution, the power to tax was the power to destroy. In our current state of affairs, it's the power to investigate, because you have to pay for lawyers and accountants to handle that. In my view, we shouldn't have it. We should have freedom of speech. We should have freedom of expression and assembly and all of those things. If people want to endorse politicians, they should have the right in the United States of America to do that. Now, I'll issue a note of caution to every pastor under this new ruling from the IRS. Realize that half your congregation is going to be supporting the other side. So you have to exercise discretion. I think you already know that, but you know, one of the examples that Corne Bekker used in that piece was John the Baptist, and he spoke against the king, and in that, he ended up losing his head. So there is a downside to this, and when you stand for righteousness and stand for justice and stand for the Bible, in literally any culture in history, be prepared, because there's always a cost to that. As the church, we need to be the conscience of our society. We need to remind political leaders of their obligations to God Almighty. We need to remind ourselves our obligations to God Almighty. And in doing that, be fearless, regardless of tax exemption or anything else. We need to stand for righteousness, because it's righteousness that exalts a nation.